Okay, I guess you can get started. Good afternoon. I'm going to do the video thing again. I don't know if people used it from prior semesters, but I'm going to continue to do that. So welcome to Network Sensor Systems, and hope you all had a good summer. How many of you are ready for summer to be over and ready to come back to class? Still feels nice and warm and summery outside, right? So anyway, so let's, so this is the grad undergrad class. I think the class is evenly split between grads and undergrads. So today I'll go do a brief. Let's see. So today we'll look at a very high level picture of what are sensor networks. More in terms of what are sensor networks that in the context of this class, right? So how many of you have any background in sensor networks in any context? How many of you worked in, most of you are raising hands. So why don't we just go and introduce ourselves and say what you've done so far, right, starting from here.
I'm Brendan McNeil.
Okay.
I've done work in the double E.
Okay.
Since
so modes and,
yeah.
So you programmed in C and all those things, okay.
I'm Jeff Hemis, and I have done some work with Team Track.
Okay.
With Dr. Spain and Dr. Polbauer.
Okay.
Mainly in the area of distributed localization.
Okay. And
I'm Nick Schott. I haven't really done anything with sensor.
Okay.
I'm Nick Ransom. I haven't done anything with it either.
Okay.
I'm Charles Toole. I did a little bit last semester. I worked primarily with the Stargate, trying to install a new operating system for that, but didn't get a chance to do too much with it.
Okay.
I'm Patrick Gallen, and I haven't done much with it.
Chris Miller. I've done some work in setting up the Stargates and the crossbow modes.
Okay.
I'm Brian Reese. I haven't done anything with sensor.
Okay.
I'm Nick Rowland. I do a little bit in the real-time system class with Stargates and wireless.
Okay.
I'm Tam Chan, and I work on Team Track and maybe a little in the geo-aware real-time systems as well.
Okay.
I'm David Moore, and I got to have some fun with Team Track in Dr. Payne's class in spring as well.
Okay.
I'm Prabheda Mitra, and I have worked on mainly on minutes, but not really on sensors.
Okay. So it looks like half the class you haven't done much with sensor networks, and half the class have done a lot with modes and Stargates and stuff, right? So the sensors are everywhere, right? Sensors and sensor networks are everywhere around us. So even in this classroom, there's a menacing looking alarm system, which I have no idea why they have a alarm system for this classroom, because it doesn't look like there's anything valuable to be protected here. So it's either protecting that little box up there or what have you. So that's that. But there are sensors all around the place, right? So we use a lot of sensors throughout our life. Can you think of some place where you have seen sensors, not necessarily network, but sensors that do something for you?
Often in traffic lights, there are sensors for cars.
Okay. So how do you think it works? I don't know precisely, but how do you think it works?
I believe they're basically large-scale metal detectors,
Mm-hmm.
and so they essentially have a basic algorithm for where they're detecting vehicles to make intelligent decisions about what the signal should present for cars.
Do you think they coordinate with each other?
I think that in some cities they will coordinate them so that, for instance, major thoroughfares will have a continuous stream
Mm-hmm.
when there's significant traffic.
So like if you've driven in around Notre Dame and stuff, right? You see lots of cameras watching this stuff too, right? I have no idea what they're actually watching, right? So, but there are sensors doing something. It could just be simple metal passing through, so change the light. And I actually think it's more coordinated, right? They watch the traffic and they do stuff, right? So traffic monitoring, traffic changing and stuff, we see stuff. Some other context? you've seen sensors in some other context. Most of the laptops these days have sensors. If they fall, they react to the fall. I mean, they have a little accelerometer. They detect that it's falling. They shut off the hard drive before it falls. So when it falls, the laptop is crashed, but the hard disk protects itself, right? And if you see the iPhone, right, it does a lot of neat tricks with the with sensors, right? How many of you played with iPhone? Or if not, there's one iPhone right there. You can play with it, right? So essentially, it has like an accelerometer which figures out that you're watching this way or this way, but basically by seeing how fast it accelerates, right? So if you're holding it this way, it displays like this way. If you're holding this way, it displays the other way. Basically, by figuring out how you move. So if you move it extremely slow, there's no acceleration. It doesn't have to do stuff, right? It does other things too. So if you bring a phone near you, it detects that you're closer to a human being. It shuts off the display, kind of thing, right? So, and if you look in a modern car, I mean, a car has so many sensors from way back when. I mean, it figures out how much fuel should be inside and all those things. And modern cars have tire sensors and all those things, right? The difference between those and what you're going to read in this class is the sensors are just part of what we would call as a sensor network systems, because those are not traditionally networked, right? In the case of the traffic lights, they could be, right? But in the other cases I talked about, they're individual stuff. They're doing something. They're sensing something, and they're reacting to it. And there's not a whole lot of interesting stuff. I mean, that is the embedded community has worked on how to integrate the sensors to do a task. You know, if a laptop is falling, it reacts to it. That's interesting, but we want to do more. We want to go into a point where we can network these things so that we can do something larger, right? So in the case of the traffic light, we want to be able to kind of control the whole traffic for Notre Dame, where the traffic lights themselves talk to each other. They sense a whole bunch of stuff. They sense that there are cars coming by. They sense that there are congestion happening somewhere, or what have you. But you want them to be autonomous, but you want them to talk to each other. So the network is the more important part, right? So sensor itself has been around for a lot longer than systems. People have looked at that since I think 30s and 40s and stuff. But what got a lot of people interested was the improvements in hardware. So now you can have all these things in a fairly small package, and you can attach some computation to it, and you can deploy them and have them contact with each other. So the reason why people are excited is it kind of expands your computing out into the physical world, right? And sometimes it's called sensor actuator networks, where from the environment you get these feedback. You get these stuff saying, you know, I see a car coming here. I see a car moving through these things. And then you kind of react back to the environment by turning the lights and stuff, right? So you want that loop to go through, and that's what people got really excited. So the field kind of, you know, really peaked around late 90s and early 2000s kind of thing, where people are talking about a whole bunch of these things. But now it's kind of matured, where people are actually building real systems, so they have a lot more experience with those. And that's the focus of the systems component of this class, right? So I'm not going to focus on the theoretical aspects of what you can do, but more on what is really possible, right? So for example, one of the things that people like to do is, for the traffic lights, you could imagine connecting all the traffic lights in the whole US and have them all talk to each other, have them all build this model where the traffic flows wonderfully, right? Which may mean that you're connecting, say, hundreds of thousands of these sensors and do some stuff, right? We would like to get there, right? But I don't think we are anywhere close to that level of dealing with many machines. We are slowly getting there, right? So the largest deployment you see are in hundreds or thousands kind of thing. So the focus is not on what we want to do, but more on what is currently possible, right? So in terms of the team track, so how big deployments do you guys have?
Let's see. Well, we we did a number of exercises in the distributed systems class last spring, and I think we had about 15 nodes altogether.
Yeah, so a lot of papers from late 90s and stuff would talk about millions and billions of sensors, right? 15, 20 to millions and billions is a big gap, right? So we will try to keep that in mind, right? So those are two things. So the other thing is I think a lot of the principles can be learned without actually having to do gory programming. I don't really believe in like killing yourself to program. So I'm not going to insist on you programming with modes and stuff. You said you program with modes, right? What is the experience with programming in modes?
Frustrating.
It's frustrating because
it's just really hard to troubleshoot.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of issues. I mean, they are so small, they have so little memory, so little everything. There's no debugging support, there's no on and on, right? So we could have like a course project on how to do modes and spend all the time being frustrated with like that kind of programming and stuff, right? So I'm not going to insist like that at all for the class, right? Like higher level can still expose many of the contents and stuff without going to the details. If you want, so we have I'll talk about the course policies and stuff. So one of the main components we have is a course project. I'm not going to insist that you should work with modes and stuff. In fact, I strongly discourage you from doing that. If you do want to proceed, that's fine, but that's not the interest of the course too. So I want to keep myself in a narrow range where normal kind of programming should work, so we can try some of this stuff. And we don't have a goal of having millions and billions of nodes talking to each other, right? What can we do in a realistic kind of scenario where we can do something and still learn something, right? So that's the context we want to keep it. The reason I'm saying all this stuff is there's a whole bunch of people who work on sensor networks and systems, right? If you talk to different people, it means different things to them, right? You can talk to people in like geology, right? They actually use these things, they deploy these things to measure what have you, right? And their sense of what the sensor network and sensor systems is a lot different than what computer science we look at kind of stuff. So that's why I want to make it clear where we come from, right? So the key thing to remember is they're autonomous and they want to interact with each other on their own. There's no central one controlling any of these devices. And the idea is that the reason people like sensors are they're supposed to be inexpensive, so there's lots of them, so they can be disposable. And so since there are lots of them, you can have better coverage because you have more of them, right? So the assumption is more is better than few, right? And the idea is more can be knocked out and you still get good performance, right? And the keyword here is more and better, not absolute terms. And as we see in the next few slides, it means different things to different people, right? So let's. So before we go in, what do you think is? I guess some of you worked on sensors and some of you haven't, right? What do you think is the scope of sensors? Like, what do you think is the capabilities of what these things should do, especially for people who haven't done much? Yeah.
I know when I signed up for the course, I kind of pictured, have you ever seen the movie Twister? They take a bunch of football balls and throw them into a tornado, and they all communicate information about it. That was the only picture I really had of it.
Okay. How many of you for the people who have actually done something, right? How many of you actually believe that movie? How many of you seen the movie Twister? So like in the movie, like finally, like at the end, like the climax is they have these little balls with like shining lights and stuff, and then they kind of throw it into the tornado, and it kind of goes up and measures wind velocity and like it senses something, and then the data starts streaming back, and there's a guy with a laptop, and you can see the stuff like kind of flying up and stuff. Ignore for a moment that it's kind of hard to figure out how high you are with the little thing. I mean, you can figure out what's the wind velocity and stuff, right? But they all kind of like talk to each other, and you see this like beautiful plume on the laptop, right? How many of you believe that you can actually do it? Forget about the hardware. Let's say I give you the hardware, right?
It would be incredibly complex.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we are particularly good at doing this stuff. But that's a people are working on doing that. Yeah.
Well, if you had real good military-grade GPS receivers, you might be able to in each of these.
Yeah, but still the coordination and making those kind of stuff, right? I mean, it's very hard, right? I was going to say something, I forgot. So this is a slide I got from somebody from Army Research Lab from 2002, right? And they want to do it all. I mean, they have the Pentagon at one end, and then you have like flying things with UAVs with things attached to them flying around the battlefield. There are other UAVs with bombs and stuff flying around. So if you look around, there must be all this. I mean, there's a satellite flying up there, and there's a deployment up here, bombs and all those things around, right? So one of the projects they were talking about was this smart dust kind of thing. So you kind of like throw this around in Afghanistan or something. You go into the country, throw these things from the air, and they all start communicating back with you. So then you kind of know exactly what is happening on the field. So you get the temperature and air pressure and all those things. And you also have acoustic monitor, which listening in on the whole battlefield. So they come back and say that they're detecting a truck going by, which is heavier. So they kind of know that there's a enemy moving there. They talk to the UAV, sends a bomb, and shoots them down, right? Sounded really fantastic. I'm sure Army is like working on a lot more of these things. One thing you realize is when you look at these things, right, each things are considered cheap based on what they're trying to do, right? So if you look at the little sensors out there with all these little things, I don't know what they are. Let's assume they're measuring temperature or what have you, right? They're a little cheaper than something like the ones that are flying around, right? Like a UAV flying around kind of stuff, right? It's a little bigger, it's a little different kind of thing. It's flying around on the field. It may be coordinating, it may be part of this sensor system. But the cost that we're talking about, it may be worth $1 million, right? So if you have a $1 million aircraft flying around, right, attaching infrared sensor, which is $100,000 to it, may not be considered expensive, right? And I think I have a slide in a few things. So different contexts, different things are considered inexpensive. Different contexts, different things are considered expendable, right? So there's no blanket thing which says what is cheap, what is expensive. I think the part that they're talking to each other and coordinating something is important. We still call them inexpensive, right? So one of the, like a couple of slides later, we have one on infrared sensor they have. Infrared, I think the infrared camera they had was $50,000, right? He said, and if you look at the slide, they call it low inexpensive, right? It is inexpensive because the previous generations cost a lot more, right? And how many of you have like military, army sort of background? Okay, so you may be able to add stuff. So one of the things that he was saying was, let me add this part, right? So he said, we are talking about winning a war, losing wars, right? So he was like, we send these like this looking like this thing which like this with the camera attached to it. He says you send it into the battlefield, and if somebody wants to shoot that, that's fine, and it's $100,000 or something with the infrared camera. But he said the other alternative is you have to send a human being, human soldier in there. So compared to that, $100,000 is cheap, right? Sorry.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, you talk about monetary costs, but if you are, for like military applications, if you're testing for, say, chemical agents in a particular area, what's better, to dump a bunch of sensors in that area and detect the presence of chemical agents, or do it the old way where you deploy a bunch of soldiers out there with paper strips, and you put people at risk for that type of environment. So yeah, there are other advantages besides the monetary cost.
You were going to say?
We're in the same service, so we kind of think about it the same way.
Okay.
So, but yeah, I mean,
what service is that?
Air Force.
Air Force, okay.
What the Army and stuff they're doing now, they'll send in a robot or like some other sensor and they'll clear a building or look for bombs and things like that, like roadside bombs, especially as being important recently. and they'll just seek to destroy those with a robot rather than sending in guys with 60-pound lead suits and just hoping that it's not powerful enough to rip apart part of the suit and take something with it. So, I mean, it's a lot. I mean, it may be $300,000 for a robot, but that's way less than infinitely inexpensive compared to the human.
Yeah. So when it comes from the mode kind of stuff, right? The modes probably cost like a few dollars or whatever, but so all these are still considered part of the sensor setup, right? The other stuff they were, so one of the other, some agency, unknown agency to me, right? They're talking about detecting nuclear radiation through ports and stuff. So they said the nuclear radiation, I have no hardware background, right? So the nuclear radiation stuff that they had could fit on an 18-wheeler right now, right? So they consider that to be small and portable, right? Because they said you can move it around in an 18-wheeler, right? For that, it's still a lot better than having to move the cargo into a facility to detect some things, right? So if you're talking about cargo container, trying to figure out if there's something going through that stuff, they said that's fine, right? They would like to make it smaller, but they were not looking at Star Trek kind of, you just point at something and say, okay, there's a nuclear radiation kind of stuff, right? And they said there's a lot of reasons why you can't make them smaller kind of stuff, but they were perfectly happy with that. And another Air Force kind of person, he said, if you can figure out if there's nuclear radiation from the air, that's good enough. And for that, if it can fit into the cargo hold of the aircraft, that was fine too. Of course, they're expensive. Of course, they are, in raw terms, they sound expensive. In raw terms, they sound big. But we'll call them all small because they're smaller than something else which they were out there, right? And so this is the picture they had, and they got lots of money from different agencies, spread the money. When there's a lot of money, lots of research happens in the university, so we have lots of papers to choose from, right? So the definition we'll go with is you have some node which has some sort of a sensor, it has some sort of computation, some sort of a communication package, right? We're not going to restrict ourselves and say the communication has to be wireless, because depending on what you're trying to do, wired or wired may make sense, right? So one of the other projects that I heard that the highway department is doing to check the bridges and stuff is to put these sensors while you're building the road. Put the concrete. You put these sensors into the concrete, right? And they harness energy from the passing vehicles through piezoelectric effect, right? They power themselves, and they use wireless because you have to get the data from the concrete out to something to read it, right? You couldn't hold the wire because you're putting it into the concrete mixer, which puts it down, so you don't know where the wires go. And you put these things on, and you leave them on for 50, 100 years or what have you, and then have sensors on the side which are detecting the stresses on the bridge, right? Which is all wired from that point, because there's no reason why you couldn't wire a bridge, because it's going to be there for a long time. So have the data from that point on is going through wired, through cables and power cables and so on and so forth. And the sensors do not move. Hopefully you don't want them to move because they are encrusted in the concrete, and you want them to stay there, keep sensing for a long period of time, right? Of course, you still have the notion that you can't fix them, right? So the sensor, there's a whole bunch of sensors that are out there, and including temperature, humidity, magnetic field, acoustic, acceleration, and people talk about sensing human, have this in a human body kind of stuff. So check your blood sugar level, video, radiation monitor, whatever. And some sensors are inherently more larger, expensive, or what have you, right? The key is they are much better than what they were otherwise. Again, they don't have too much computation, so it could be at the state of the little mote and stuff, which practically could do nothing, to something which is fairly large, but still not as large as what you could have. It's unlikely you're going to send a cluster of computers into the battlefield or what have you. And networking may or may not be wired, or it could be wired, wireless, what have you, however you want to get the data out. And depending on how the system is set up, it may be powered, it may not be powered. So energy may be an issue, may not be an issue, right? So one of the things that they had was attaching these things to tanks. And they said, you don't worry about energy for a tank, because if you can move a tank, you have enough energy to run these things, right? Obviously, you don't want something which is consuming 10 megawatt or something, but normal, your devices are fine with those things. Some of the things which are flying in a UAV and all those things, you're fine without worrying about energy and stuff. And they usually tend to be cheaper, right? Cheaper than something else. So when you think about projects and stuff, you don't have to restrict yourself and say, I want something to be as small as possible, or what have you, right? Anything else could be considered to be sensor component. And whatever was from like a previous generation is this generation's sensors, right? And in fact, your Stargate has like what, a 400 megahertz processor, right? How many of you use the Stargate? Yeah. So what does it have?
I think it all watches 400 megahertz. They vary a little bit
Yeah.
by model, but yeah.
Yeah, so 400 megahertz was not considered to be a mode in 1999 or something like that, right? So the key we want to worry about is the number. The number is larger than what you imagine on desktop. And again, it depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to cover Afghanistan with this smart dust, then you're thinking about millions and billions. If you're talking about radiation monitors, trying to figure out in a port how many cargo containers go through, you're not looking at billions. You're looking at maybe 10 or something, right? Or 10 or a few of those. And energy consumption may be important, right? So I took some pictures of the different modes. I don't know how many of you have seen it, right? There are these. I think this is the smart dust, the one on the coin. And actually, if you look closely, there's a little green thing. I think that's the actual device. And there's a picture-like thing. I think that's where it gets this solar energy. I don't know too much. I mean, I just got the picture, right? So those things are pretty inexpensive. You have to throw a whole bunch of them. You deal with different issues. I think that one is the size of a 9-volt battery, because I think that's the battery holder. There's also the video monitor, video sensor. This is a little bigger. I think that's a Stargate class 400 megahertz processor with the PCMCI card and a video camera and stuff like that. And then, of course, there are people who do this. This is the one from the volcano monitoring stuff from Harvard. So here they're doing seismology kind of experiments. So here you want to leave this around the volcano to monitor the stuff. So I think they have the communications antenna up there and a solar panel out there, right? So I don't think you're worried too much about space in this situation, right? Because it looks empty, right? So you don't worry about space and stuff. You worry about one of the things that people who do these things worry about. We'll see that in a few papers after the a couple of lectures. Is you have to worry about how to do this on the environment, right? So in this case, you don't really care about the space because it's practically empty, but you have to worry about how to keep these things stable, right? So for example, if you leave the solar panel out there, you don't want to go there to change it every day. So you want to put this up and then have this keep working for a while, right? So what can you think will go wrong if you were to do this? There's like a basket kind of, like a box kind of thing with hopefully electronics in there. And then there's looks like a solar panel, right? What would you have to worry about if you were to deploy this? Yeah.
Oh, you're monitoring earthquakes and seismic activity, so
Mm-hmm.
if an earthquake hits, obviously it's probably going to break a lot of your stuff.
Yeah, so hopefully it's the same as the movie, right?
Whatever else.
So
Rocks.
if it crashes after the fact, you don't particularly care, right? If suddenly the ground opens up, the whole thing falls in. If you get the readings before it falls, hopefully you're fine, right? Yeah.
What if an animal decides that a solar panel is something shiny that it wants to take back to this world?
Yeah, you worry about animals taking it away, right? There's a project which did this by the coastal area, right? They found that the seagulls really like to stand on those, right? Because it's kind of high up there. Because obviously you can't hide it inside, so it has to be high up there. So they like to stay up there on top of those, and they like to do what they like to do, right? somebody has to go and remove the bird poop, which you can't because it's, hopefully you leave it there for a long time, right? You see, the bird poop is a big problem because they have these things. But you can't you can't keep the panel like this, then you get no sun. So it has to face out like this. And also I think birds are flying into the thing because they were at the right spot. The birds fly in, they're killing birds. You can't, obviously you can't put spikes and stuff to keep the birds out because it doesn't look for good press conference when you say, we've been monitoring the Oregon coast. So there's a project which is trying to monitor the Oregon coast, right? We've been monitoring the Oregon coast and there are no birds left because, we killed them all, right? But it is something that you worry about. We're not going to talk too much about them. So we'll read about some of the experience that people had. But that's one thing that we never had to worry about before because computers were inside the, air-conditioned room and stuff. But now it's going out into the world. The other stuff, when people put them underwater, right, you have to worry about slime, right? You have to worry about slime and goop filling up after a year or so, right? And that's especially a problem for cameras. One of the things that, if any of you been to London, right, they have cameras watching. How many of you been to London? If you haven't been to London, they have lots of these cameras, right? And they're obviously right in your face watching you, right? At least in the US, they're not obvious. They kind of are inconspicuous, right? So if you're driven on any traffic exchange, these days you seem to have 4 cameras watching you, right? But they try not to be in your face, but London ones seem to be in your face to make you know that you're being monitored, right? How many of you think it's actually would be useful? Based on what I kind of was saying about one of the guys who was using, yeah.
Well, I would say there's a difference. Something may be very useful, but also be considered an invasion of privacy.
Yeah, I'm not worried about that. I mean, that it's there, and apparently people seem fine with that. I mean, yeah, that's an excellent point, right? So let me get back to that in a moment, right? But in terms of doing what you want it to do, how effective do you think it would be to have cameras everywhere watching people? Yeah.
I mean, there's a point where you can have too much data to try and crunch. So if you have all these hundreds of thousands of cameras, you're not going to have enough computing power or manpower to really look at all of them. So I mean, I think there's a point where there's just too many cameras.
So that is a problem that has to be solved, right? Sensor network, that's a fundamental problem that you need to solve, right? The fundamental problem is you have all these things out there. How do you make sure that you only get the good data, good information, and not the bad information? It's a fundamental problem that has to be solved, right? So if you don't know how to solve it, then we have more work to do, right? So that has to be solved because that's inherent to all these things, right? Because all these things are sending information. All these things are sensing some information, right? You don't have capabilities to compute, try to figure out what's going on, right? And we'll see how you might do that, but that has to be solved. If you can't solve that, then this whole field doesn't exist, right? But that's excellent observation because that's one which that's the reason why I don't think we know how to go to billions of nodes, right? Because we don't know how. I don't think we know how to build billions of anything, right? We kind of build maybe thousands, maybe 10,000 kind of thing, but billions, we have never done that, right? But we have to solve that, right? Yeah.
I think in the case of the cameras, there's probably too much data for real-time monitoring, but it might be useful for investigating a crime or something. A particular street corner, somebody got mugged, you can use data from whatever last period of time to investigate.
But turns out, before we get to that point, right, turns out that all these things become dirty, right? So you don't want them to be nice. Like if you put a camera right here, chances are it will be relatively clean, right? Unless you guys spray paint it or something, right? But if you keep it out in the, out in the elements, right? You might have looked around. I mean, you might have seen things, tend to get grimy and stuff, right? And turns out most of the London cameras. So I was talking to one of the guys who's investigating, who's looking at this they're from England and stuff. So most of the cameras you can't really make out, right? You can make out that there's a human being, right? He said many of the cameras it's hard to make out whether there's a male or female or a child. They can make out whether it's a human being, right? So he said the effect, the feeling that it's there is a lot more, it achieves a lot more goals than the camera actually finding stuff, right? Even if you can process, so the question is how do you get all this data, how do you figure out all this stuff, and I don't think they have real-time capabilities to look at all the things and do something about it, right? But the environment of how do you keep those, it's not clear, right? Obviously you don't want somebody to go up there every day to keep it clean so you can look at all those scenarios. But you have to solve those problems of how do you keep the lens clean where dirt doesn't get in, or intentional stuff you probably can figure out. I mean, if somebody goes and spray paints them, you can probably figure out. But how do you get those things solved, right? So like the same thing here. So the other projects, I think we read the paper. The first one which they did was to put them into bird nests. There's a bird called petrel off of Maine coast, right? So this little island that like ornithologists know nothing about. So they put these sensors into the bird, so they burrow a ground, like a nest underground, and they put this inside to figure out what's the temperature and all those things, right? And first year, it was a mess because the birds are doing whatever they were doing. You don't know what to prepare for because you don't know what they actually do. So you leave them inside, and they peck on the cables, and chicks learn to do something. So you have to. So at the end, you have to build these things which are so strong that nothing can get through, which means that they can't measure the humidity or temperature or whatever, right? So you leave these things. But if you have to measure, you have to come out of the cocoon, and things are going awfully wrong, right? We'll talk a little bit about those, but maybe not a whole lot as we look. We'll read about a project which is trying to figure out how the animals behave in Africa, right? ZebraNet, which we read a paper, right? And you can imagine if you wanted to put a sensor on animals, you have to deal with other kind of stuff, right? If you put it on a tiger, you have to worry about what it does and whether it can still get some information. Yeah, so this is the sensor from the same presentation. This is the infrared sensor. I forget whether it's 20,000 or 50,000, right? But it's a rather large amount, right? So this is not the infrared sensor that you have on your camcorder and stuff. So if you have a camcorder, most of them have a night mode, right? If you put a night mode, you get this green picture, and that's pretty inexpensive. But that's on the, I think, lower end of the infrared. But this is the higher end, which is the more harder part. You don't need light. So this is the one which detects heat, not the ones that on your camera. This one can see in perfect darkness, right? Like just a few years back, apparently, to get these, you have to put them on liquid nitrogen, right? So even if you could bring the cost down, it's not convenient to put something which needs liquid nitrogen to cool it, right? So this particular model does not need nitrogen cooling, so they can put it on tanks and stuff, and it's, let's say 50,000, right? So he was like, oh, this is awesome. If you look at the thing, he says, low cost imager, right? It's only like 50 grand, but and I forget what this was, right? It looks like it's on the front tip of a missile, and it's detecting something as it's flying through, right? And again, the cost and size that you're looking at here are not the same as your modes and stuff, right? Does that ring a bell? I don't know what that is, but so I hope I gave we've been like talking about a whole bunch of stuff. I hope gave a sense of there's a whole bunch of different stuff. We'll try to stay at a level where we don't have to be bogged down by dealing with the lower level details, right? For people who are coming from the embedded systems or doubly kind of background, you're kind of forced to deal with that low level, but we can still learn a lot from dealing with the higher level. so since you have limited network support, you also have to worry about the fact that if you deploy these things, you might be able to go back and fix these things, right? And that's underlying thing and all this stuff, right? So for example, on the bridge scenario, the bridge is there, so you can actually go up and look at the side stuff. But the ones that you put inside the concrete, hopefully you'd never be able to get it back, right? Hopefully you don't want something where the bridge breaks up or something. You don't want to go back and dig the bridge to get the sensors. So even though it's accessible, even though the bridge is accessible, you can't get into the stuff, right? And there's limited software development tools all the way from not being able to deal with mode. I think the real mode has, do you remember how much memory it has?
Not much.
It's like 180 bytes or something, right? So if you read the papers, they talk about running operating system in 178 bytes and 2 bytes for, they save 2 bytes kind of stuff, right? All the way to even higher level systems, right? There's very little support for dealing with millions and billions of distributed systems, right? The other stuff that doesn't usually come up on distributed systems, which comes up here, is how to update these things, how to patch these things, right? We'll read a paper on those, but essentially the idea here is you deploy these sensors. Now you want to put a newer software to get newer functionality, right? You want to do this all the time. So suddenly you figured out that you can use accelerometer a certain way to figure out some threat, right? So how do you do that, right? So the best way to do that is to send a patch software which patches itself and reboots itself and continues on, right? So you have limited amount of memory, so the machine has to patch its own self and put the new software and then keep running, right? How many of you trust that you can write code that can do that? You're running some sort of software, it patches itself, right? It has to erase, so it doesn't have enough, like, so on a desktop kind of machine, one way you can do that is to install it in a different location, right? And then kind of next time reboot and then start running from the new location, right? Which is what you do for your operating systems and stuff. You have the old and the new version. You kind of move the pointer to the new version. If it doesn't work, you can kind of go back and manually do it, right? You don't have much space here, so you can only go forward. There's no previous version, and otherwise you have a brick, right? Some of you may have done this. Some of you may have updated your iPad or stuff like that. How many of you have done this in some context? Updating some software on some machine? Yeah. But which one did you do?
Oh, I had a little system that ran off a memory stick.
Okay.
And so it all had to fit, including all the software.
Okay.
500 megs.
Okay.
And so
500 megs is a lot of.
it was a lot. But you're trying to run a whole Linux
Oh,
system.
okay.
So interesting. So if you goof it up, you had to put the stick back in another computer.
Yeah, so that's the luxury you don't have on these systems, right? The luxury of, taking the machine and then wiping it, doing manual stuff, you can't do in these systems, right? We don't know how to do that, right? There are some systems which are trying to deal with that. We don't really have a good solution. That's an open solution on how to do that, right? How do you patch your system and be able to do that? I think NASA has some experience with the different Mars rovers and stuff. They've been doing these updates and stuff. I mean, they don't actually send by the time the spacecraft is sent and by the time it reaches Mars, it's been patched so many times, right? Sometimes they goof up and you have a coaster going there, but you don't want to do that, right? The other important part is calibration, right? We don't talk about it much in this class, but it's a very sensor-specific phenomenon, right? Every sensor, this goes to more of a doubly kind of background, it has to be calibrated to give you good results, right? So for example, if you have a temperature sensor, it gives you some readings, right? It gives you some readings. You have to calibrate it to know what that means, right? So for example, it may say that the voltage level is like 1 volt, right? So you have to know how to change that 1 volt to 70 Fahrenheit or some temperature, right? And calibration is a very hard thing. And usually if it's a high-end system, you have to go through equipment to calibrate these things. But when you put them out there, right, how do you calibrate them on the fly, right? Again, we don't have a whole bunch of, I mean, we know how to do it on lesser context, but there's a lot more to be left, right? For example, in the case of the Twister movie, right? You throw it into this thing, right? And it's measuring something, right? It's not going to be linear if you have any kind of hardware background, right? It's rarely linear, right? So for example, if the air pressure goes up from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 100 to 200 or whatever, right? Whatever sensing is not going to be linear, right? You don't know what exactly goes inside that tornado too. So you're trying to calibrate on a place where you don't know what it is. But obviously you're getting results and you have to manipulate, map what you're measuring to what you have. Otherwise you have a bunch of numbers and you don't know what that means, right? So for example, the tornado might be going at 200 miles, or if you're off and it measures 100, right? It's a completely different things, right? Yeah, and then the stuff that David brought up, which is security and privacy, right? How do you think it fits into the whole thing? You're measuring these things and what have you. Are they compatible or are they? Let's look at privacy, right? Yeah.
So for example, if you have a bunch of cameras watching a particular area, and you're sending a signal to like a wireless signal or something back to a monitoring station, if someone else could just easily see exactly what's going on, they know how to access whatever protocol is for communicating with the cameras. So I mean, you could have someone who, like, say you're at a bank or something like that, someone else could. You see in movies, they always find like tap in the video system so they can see exactly where the guards are and stuff like that, and they can go and break in that way or something.
Yeah. So in the case of the banks, right, with the camera, how do they protect the camera from bad people, from our sense of movies, right? What do they do in the movies to get to that? You've seen in many movies, right?
Nothing.
Huh?
Usually.
No, but the hero does something, right? Hero does something. A hero or a villain does something to magically does this. I mean, they always have this one person who's like so smart they can look at anything and make it do anything, right? But what do they actually? I mean, this one piece of reality they always had, right? Which is, how do they attack these things, right? Can you imagine what that is?
Usually they have a magical wire they clip onto it.
They first break the physical security, right? They actually, they put a cable or something, but to do that, they have to break the physical security which is built into this whole system, right? The assumption the bank has is people cannot get into the wall something, right? But the villain or the hero, who are this super person, would somehow go into the bank and then put these clips and then do whatever, right? Right? It's rarely they don't. So in the case of the wired infrastructure, the security is violated once you violate the physical security, right? But if you don't assume that, the physical security is violated, right? Most of these things are, the sensor network, the assumption you do is you have lots of sensors which are monitoring the whole thing, and they're trying to figure out what is going on. They're trying to figure out something is bad, something is good, or whatever, right? For the most part, privacy is not something that you worry about, right? You can say something like, oh, we don't actually look into those. We don't actually look at the video to see what it is. In the case of traffic, what can go wrong with the privacy on the traffic control system? You have these cameras looking at you, right? They could use that to see if you're speeding, right? It's very trivial to use that, right? But they kind of sell you like, oh, we don't worry about it. We won't do that kind of stuff. So they get away from that. But designing a system which is aware of people's privacy and not let you do something that you don't want it to do is inherently very hard. Most of the sensor systems that I know of completely avoid that. They don't think about it. They don't want to deal with it. They just turn a blind eye. They just say, this is fine. And it kind of works because there are two kind of people who work on this kind of stuff. One is the academics. So we choose something that is a guinea pig which doesn't really complain, right? So if you guys walk around with a team track camera and you're watching students, right? I don't know how you deal with the privacy of the students, right? So either you don't, or what people do is they watch volcanoes and these birds and stuff, right? And volcanoes rarely are known to complain about privacy, so it's kind of good, right? So it looks like a joke. So one of the projects which actually I may have to edit this stuff out, right? Which is they were trying to set up a sensor in our lake, right? I forget what the name of the lake, right? The one inside the campus, right? They were trying to put sensors. They were trying to measure stuff about the lakes to learn something, right? So, and they were trying to put another sensor in the golf course, right? Trying to measure something of the runoff water and stuff, right? There's some discussion, and one of the things that they didn't want is they didn't want to measure certain parameters, right? Like for example, on the lake, they didn't want to measure the temperature, right? Do you want to guess why they don't want to measure the lake temperature? How many of you have seen the lake? Some of you may be new to campus, right? How many of you seen that little lake? So there's one thing interesting about the lake, right? So if you go in the middle of the winter when it's like really, really cold, right? Lake Michigan can freeze, but not this little lake, right? Right? How many of you noticed that this lake rarely freezes, right? You know why?
Power plant.
Yeah, it's a cooling thing for a power plant, right? So what will happen if you started to measure the temperature of the lake?
Won't change like it normally should.
No, it's a more sinister reason. That's why I said I probably have to delete this scene, right?
What would the demonstration kind of look bad?
Somebody can actually sue us, right? Because we all know that it's being warmed up by the power plant. We all know that that has some impact on something. We all know the lake looks nice in the winter and stuff. But somebody who wants to sue us for destroying that lake, right? All they have to do is take your paper and say, look, here's the data. Here's the data which shows that this lake has been, this is the precise temperature of this lake at every depth for the last 2 years, right? And I rest my case, right? And you can use that to sooner or later, right? The same thing they were doing with the golf course. They didn't want to measure the something on the water. I forget what it is, but it's a thing which comes out from fertilizer, right? Because the point, the golf courses the grasses don't grow by themselves. They're being fertilized and stuff, and the runoff goes into the lakes and stuff, right? You want to know what the effluent runoff to the lakes and stuff, but you don't want to know this is being caused by us kind of thing, right? So we care about privacy for those, right? Those are not privacy, but those are stuff, right? For example, I cannot move the camera and capture you guys, right? Because I don't have permission to capture you guys, right? It's not exactly true, right? I can capture him. I can capture other people. I can capture people who are older than certain age when the federal something happens, right? I don't know if it's 18 or 21 kind of thing, right? So if you are less than, is it 18 or 21?
It depends. I don't know about being videotaped and put out on the internet or anything. I think
But
18.
Yeah, till 18, I think you have to get permission from your parents, right? And then I think undergrad, you have the federal something on privacy stuff, right? Grad students don't have that. So grad students, I can take picture. It's a public space, But if you're undergrad, one set of rule comes in. And then if you're under 18, another set of rule comes in, right? I think under 18, I can't ask you if it's okay to videotape you. Over 18, undergrad, some of the law kicks in, right? So those we worry about. So people, if you look at the papers from academicians, people rarely take pictures of human beings because you don't want to walk into all the minefields. So so that's why people study all these volcanoes and all those things, because it's easier. The other people who study sensor networks are the Army, right? Army rarely worries about privacy, especially if it's in, say, you deploy this in Afghanistan, right? None of the Army people I talk to worry too much about the privacy of the people they are monitoring, right? Because they're trying to see whether this is, Osama bin Laden or somebody else, right? If it's the person you want, you kill him. The other person should be lucky that they didn't get killed, right? So they're not going to complain and say, you violated my privacy, you took a picture of me, right? So we've been kind of good in that sense, right? But that's a big problem, and I think that's a fundamental problem that you can't really solve because these are designed to be looking out the whole world. But to also say you should look at the whole world, but you shouldn't, if you see him, don't do anything, right? The problem is it has to figure out it's him. So it has to first do all the recognition to get to the point where it knows it's him, and then it has to stop doing some things. And it's very easy to violate at that point, right? So I don't know how we're going to solve that. I don't think we're going to solve that, but we're kind of good with that for a number of reasons, right? And some of the applications, we'll see some of the examples of those. Environmental monitoring is one of the favorite things from universities and stuff. Traffic and habitat and so on and so forth. Industry sensing and diagnostics is a big thing. So one of the projects we look at, Intel is doing that because they want to make sure that the plant, what's happening in the plant, it's all completely monitored. Infrastructure protection, power grids and water distributions, those are important applications. Battlefield awareness. And again, depending on the kind of stuff you're doing, the actuating may be different. If you're in the battlefield, you shoot missiles. If you're habitat monitoring, so you're monitoring how the trees are performing and stuff, you want to be as good to the system as possible. And in the context of intelligent home, making your homes be intelligent and stuff and deal with stuff, it's one of the dreams of people. How many of you watched there's a program called Eureka on Sci-Fi? It's kind of like an awful program. It comes on recently, right? It's kind of like I don't know. There's nothing good to say about the program, except there is, the sheriff lives in a house, which is awesome, right? I mean, it talks back. I mean, it looks like a Star Trek kind of thing, except it knows more. I mean, it actually has personality. It gets jealous and all those things, but it monitors the whole house kind of thing, right? So that's something that people always imagine will happen in the future. That the house kind of knows everything. In some sense, it monitors the temperature, changes the temperature and all those things, but you want it to do other stuff. When you come into the house, make coffee and all those things for you kind of stuff. So that's one of the goal of those systems. And here again, you have a lot of these sensors and trying to talk to each other and stuff. And I was reading one of the papers from South Korea. Apparently, they have a lot of these newer houses built with a whole bunch of monitoring things. And I think I was talking to one of the people. So apparently they have sensors and monitors for everything in the house, including for the gas valve, right? I have no idea why you would want to put the gas valve on something that is monitored and controllable from elsewhere, because I'm a lot more happier to have the gas valve be like physically closable rather than automatically something turning it off and on, because I don't know, but that's what they're doing over there, right? So in terms of the course goals, we look at some of these things. So we'll go through the textbook for a while. We'll go through the chapters for a while, and then we'll look at some of the applications that people have looked at, like 3 or 4 papers on that one. And then we'll focus on video storage and security, just because they're at a higher level than a whole bunch of other papers. A lot of papers talk about how to program, how to do the NESC, TinyOS, and stuff for people who worked on those. And they're trying to get over the restrictions they had for the hardware kind of things. We kind of ignore that, and we look at these higher level kind of applications because they're not so worried about the lower level details, but they can do something more interesting on top of those, right? And they still form of the fundamental basic sensor systems. And we will have a significant course project, right? So the organizations will have the course text. We'll see the couple of applications just to get a sense of what people are working on, and then we'll look at some of the challenges in 3 different domains. I don't know why the font kind of changed into something, right? So we'll have a midterm and a final, and 2 homework assignments midway between the midterm and the final, right? Those are take home. So each one of them is 10% for 20%. So the return component is 55% of the grade, right? You have the midterm, final, and the 2 homework assignments. And then the next part is the homework project, right? Homework project, so how many of you are actually actively working? I guess you guys worked on something for the course project, but how many of you are actively working on something beyond that for research? I guess it applies more for graduate students then, yeah.
I mean, in networks?
Yeah.
Oh, well, not really network sensors, it's just sensors.
I'm willing to broadly define what that is, right? So my goal is, if you're doing something for something else, if you're doing something for research in any context, and could be sensor kind of stuff, I think the course project should be, doing that, because then that way you get something out of this course beyond what you're trying to do, right? So we'll have to define it kind of loosely. So I would like to talk to each person to see if they have some idea like that, right? Not so loosely that you kind of say, okay, there'll be no computer, there's no network, we'll work on philosophy or something, right? So other than that, so what we'll do is, within the next 2 weeks, this week and next week, I would like to talk to each of you to see what you want to do. So for undergrads who are not working on something, we'll help define something that could be a course project. For people who are grad students who are working on some projects, we can go with that, right? So I would like groups of 2, right? And like most of my courses, if you're taking prior courses, I'm not a big fan of testing how good you program. So the goal, this is not a programming class, even though you may program, right? So just because you don't have strong programming background does not mean anything. But I want you to try something interesting, something that you find exciting kind of stuff. So I don't want to say you shall do this, because I'm like, more likely you don't like that, whatever that is, right? And I split the grades into little components, and obviously that's to make sure that people are doing something, right? So the course project does not mean that you come back on December and start doing something. So there's little milestones, little points and stuff. And again, even though there are points, they're not independent of each other, right? So for example, you cannot come back and give an excellent presentation on Shakespeare and claim that 5% for the presentation, right? Because it's all the course project, but you know what I mean, right? So the disclaimers, right? So it's a 45%. So the first goal you have to do is within the next 2 weeks, find a project partner and talk to me and see what was interesting you. If you don't have a project, then we can figure out what would be a good project to work on. And I like the proposal in a month, and mid-semester report after the fall break, right? So that's the plan right now. I was thinking of having a mini project, but then I think it's too distracting. I'm assuming people have different interests and stuff, right? And these policies, I just still have it from all the classes I taught, so I don't think it really applies here, especially for the grad component. Many of you may have seen these policies, right? If it's homework assignment and stuff, and it's graded on if you get partial credit, and if you think you deserve a little bit more partial credit than what was given to you, you have to kind of prove why you deserve more, because it was graded based on the rest of the what's the rest of the class. So if it's clearly wrong, if it's clearly if it's ranked as wrong and it is right, it's a lot more trivial. But partial credit, if you want to argue, you have to have a reason behind it.